What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Primal Performance Podcast. This is your host, Chad Sheehan, with my lovely co-host, Melissa Leach. We have a pretty good one for you guys today. So today we are speaking with Ben Tallini. He is the owner of Haven Jiu Jitsu. He's a second-degree black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. He does a lot of work in the upstate New York region, working with first responders, general population, and much more. Ben's an all-around good dude. He's built an incredible culture and facility in Baldwinsville, New York, named Haven Jiu Jitsu, and we're really glad to have you today. What's up, man?
What's up, Chad? Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, Melissa. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So if you can, just kind of give us a background about your jiu-jitsu experience and how you got started in the field.
I started jiu-jitsu when I was 19. I picked it up strictly for self-defense when I started. I had something really bad. Somebody did something in my family that was bad. They got put away in prison, and I knew I had a finite amount of time to get myself in a position where I could protect my family. So I started up Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and I did OCS for the Marines at the same time while I was in college. And then that kind of just kept going, and I never stopped doing Jiu Jitsu, basically.
When we first talked about getting into this podcast, you kind of alluded to you starting right after COVID. Obviously, so many gyms and performance facilities, jiu-jitsu, a lot of these places shut down. What made you start then?
So at the gym I was previously training at, I had been there for years and years and years, and we had talked about, I had made it very clear that I wanted to start my own program. COVID had kind of just made the world like a crazy place. And at that time, I knew it was time for me, like 100% time for me to go start my own gym. So as soon as restrictions started to get lifted, we had been probably the last maybe like 6 months of COVID had found a spot that we were looking at. We jumped on it, ended up doing the build out and everything like that, and then just kind of ran with it from there. So, and it at the end of the day, it kind of worked out because COVID had shut everything down, and a lot of gyms, not a lot in our area, but a decent amount had kind of went out of business or hadn't been doing great things to members during COVID. So there was a big gap when I opened up, which was great for us. We filled that gap, and it's been skyrocketing ever since. So
yeah. For anyone that hasn't been to your facility, I mean, I've been in wrestling rooms throughout my entire life. Melissa and I have been in performance facilities, yoga studios, you name it. One thing that's very clear and noticeable when you walk into your facility is the culture and the camaraderie, like the way people interact, the level of respect. You know better than anyone when you walk into some of these martial arts facilities, tons of ego. It's like the very last place anyone walking to the general public for their first class wants to step foot into. So if you can kind of talk about how you've built that and how you've shaped that culture that you have at Haven.
So, we have a pretty ball-busting atmosphere at the gym. And I am pretty anti like that traditional martial arts stuff. I'm not a big fan of bowing. I'm not a big fan of honestly, all the weirdness that kind of brings along with it in martial arts. I mean, you'll hear me talk about all the time. I'm not a big fan of belts because belts can create a hierarchy that's not based on competency like it is in wrestling. So I'm not even a fan of belts. The only reason why we do belt promotions is just so people are in proper divisions for tournaments. So the big thing is I have a couple of views when people are coming in. So at the end of the day, people are paying for a product, and they should be happy and want to have fun at the gym. So first and foremost, when people are coming in, I want it to be the place where they're having fun, not even thinking about a workout or anything like that. I want people to come in because they want to be at the gym. And then secondly is when people come in, you're going to see some gyms that kind of tend to be like, there's going to be a giant gulf of skill like in that mid tier, and there's going to be a bunch of really new people who don't know what they're doing, and then they're going to have their bunch of like super competitors. And then all the coaches do is focus mainly on just the competitors, right? I am under the opinion that the faster I can get brand new people in the gym better at jiu-jitsu, the faster they are at being better training partners, which is just better for everybody, including the competitors, because it just brings the overall level of the gym up. So we take we take it very seriously that everybody's in there to learn and help each other out to get better, because that's the fastest way that everybody gets better at the gym, basically.
So one thing that you or I can point out whenever you walk into your facility, whether you're at tournaments, on the sleeve, on the shirts, throughout the entire facility, is the words "moderately okay." Now, when I first joined, and just so people know, I'm at your facility probably twice a week max, just because of time and distance. But when I first joined, besides the ball busting atmosphere and like you just shit talking and talking shit, like Chad, where the fuck have you been? Stuff like that, is the words "moderately okay." I'm like, why would you have that on your branding? And now I have a really deep understanding of what that actually means. So can you kind of explain what that is?
So it's important that the ego thing, right? So nobody's going to take themselves too seriously at the gym if everyone's like, I'm the fucking best, because that's where the ego starts to get crazy at the gym. And you'll hear me ball bust guys, we always want achievable goals. So if everybody's goal is to just be moderately okay at jiu-jitsu, everybody's going to get there. Plus, I mean, you've seen this at tournaments. There's nothing funnier than watching our guys wearing their moderately okay kind of self-deprecating humor and then beating the shit out of people at tournaments and like, what the fuck just happened? Like, it's my favorite. So it just comes back to that keeping it light, playful atmosphere at the gym, regardless.
Outside the principles of that atmosphere and being moderately okay and kind of checking the ego when you step in the doors, do you have philosophies when it comes to coaching, whether it's high performing athletes that have been doing it for years or people that are coming in for the first time? What kind of coaching philosophies do you have and stand by throughout?
So for new people, the hardest part is getting them used to the grind of just grappling, regardless if it's wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, doesn't matter what it is. Society now is putting out more and more people who are not used to like that level of a grind. So it's really, really hard right now to get brand new people to understand, like, and you hear me say it all the time when brand new people come in, the first 6 months to a year of jiu-jitsu is going to be awful. And then somebody new will join in, and then you kind of see where you're at that point. It's always going to be awful though, unless you enjoy that hard-working grind aspect of it. So new people, it's about getting them used to the grind of grappling. And then principles for people that were really geared towards tournaments, our athletes, the ones that want to compete in like the bigger shows. Then we take a more specific approach to body type, grappling style. Guards are usually determined based on body type for the most part when people go out to compete. And then filling in their weak points. Because what can happen is people start to get really good at certain things, and then they only focus on those things, which will basically top out their ability to get better. And we see that happen all the time as athletes start to come up to the ranks. It's like, hey, this is what I was hitting on everybody at like blue belt or purple belt, and that's what I'm going to stick with. And then that starts to diminish once they start hitting like brown and black. So it's constantly focusing on people's weak spots, but adding things to the high level athlete's game that makes sense with their game instead of just a hodgepodge of moves. It's got to be something with a very specific system, which is, I mean, you know how we coach at the gym, but we run a curriculum based approach at the gym where we usually pick a position for 2 to 3 months. Each position builds off of each other. We do the same thing all week so people can maximize reps. Honestly, it's just keeping it simple so that people can learn.
Do you want to add anything?
No, there's a couple things that I'm hearing just because I work and train yoga teachers, and one of the things that I'm noticing that I keyed into what you were saying is like people coming out of COVID there's a different level of, I don't want to say resilience, but
resistance,
but to your point, like being resistant to the grind and to the hard work. There is definitely, that's, because I led a lot of trainings pre-COVID, during COVID, post-COVID, and just we as a society is very, very different in terms of, and you may have just hit on that. And like, what are you seeing? Because I know it shows up in training yoga teachers, like how, and when people are learning new things, there's a resistance to it being hard.
Yeah.
Right. And so,
For
so like, what are you seeing? Because it's something that I'm going into a yoga teacher training at a 200 and 300 hour level this coming weekend. And it's like, yeah, you guys are going to have to learn some hard things like anatomy and like the nervous system and how that applies to movement and these yoga poses. When you're because that's what you're, slightly different, but you're teaching movement,
Yep.
right? So I think you keyed into it in terms of fun, people being able to have fun, but what are some other tools that you give people to like understand that the grind is okay and like it's okay for it to be hard?
I mean, so I think that's like one of the first things that we tell people when they come in. I think very much have become an instant gratification society, right? So when the first thing they hear out of my mouth is like, hey guys, like the first 6 months is going to be awful, I think it starts to frame it a little bit. Or some people will start to talk about, how long does it take to get good at such and such a guard? And I'm going to tell them it's like 2.5 years just to become proficient at one guard, which is a position that we play offensively and defensively off of our back. But I think when you start to reframe it with people, just how long it's going to take to get good or moderately okay, right? It changes the way that they come in, because and this is part of the problem with traditional martial arts, has become so commercialized. Like they sell black belt. It's well known. You've got 2 years as a kid and you're getting your black belt after that, right? Like we don't work that way in jiu-jitsu at all. So when people come in and you've got white belts, you've been training for like 3 years, it's like, no, that's just how it goes, guys. It's different.
Yeah.
Speaking to that, and that's another thing I noticed throughout the entire facility and training with all of you guys, is you're not rushing the process of the belt system. Can you speak to that? How you handle that and how other gyms might handle it?
Yep. So it just depends on the gym. Some gyms take a more commercialized approach where it's giving the student a carrot, right? I think at the end of the day, though, like we were talking about before, if the belt becomes the carrot, then that's not a good reason to train jiu-jitsu. You just want to enjoy grappling at the end of the day, right? And what can happen is you do like these time in belts, and you can have somebody who's training 5 or 6 days a week, who's actually an athlete, picking it up quick because people pick it up at different paces, and maybe they're putting in the time outside of class, right? And then you're going to have somebody who started with them same exact time, maybe training 1 to 2 times a week, doesn't look at jiu-jitsu outside of class, not an athlete, and maybe just doesn't care that much for it. They're just looking to get a workout in, right? Now, those two people get promoted at the same pace. That's absolutely ridiculous. And what can happen is coming back to the ego and why I dislike belts so much, is you could have a purple, brown, or black belt that's essentially a time in belt at a gym, and you can have somebody who's really putting in the work outside of class. Maybe they're a blue belt, and you've got this upper belt telling them what to do, even though this person is much better in all realms of jiu-jitsu. It drives me bonkers. So a lot of gyms will go that route, and I do believe at the end of the day, because I've seen it personally, it does create a toxic environment. So yeah, and honestly, the hardest thing that we have at the gym is when we have people who come in from other gyms who are either previously ranked or have a different idea of what the belt system, how to progress should be. And it's really hard to get somebody from another gym that comes into our place to be like, guys, it really is just about where you're going to be competing at. If I think you're going to be competitive with people your age and belt level, then we're going to bump you. But if not, like I'm not a big fan of time in belts if we can avoid it, basically.
Do you feel like this is a really cool conversation? Do you feel like, because martial arts is it's an ancient practice, very similar to yoga. And what I'm kind of hearing is you're almost like, I don't want to say, maybe the word is revolutionizing. You're going a little bit against the grain of the industry, right? To evolve it. And I think what I want to point out, because there are a lot of people who listen to this who are coming from like strength training or nutrition or yoga, and especially in these ancient practices, there's like, well, we can't evolve it because it's an ancient practice. And it's like, no, we can evolve it because once you know better, you do better. Yep. And I just want to, do you feel like there's a little bit of that? Because your why behind why you're doing it makes a lot of sense. Do you find that people who are coming in, there's like an educational component that's
100%. And martial arts is funny that way, right? Like Bruce Lee was big revolutionary because he was like, be like water, use what works, get rid of what doesn't, right? And then people forget about that. And then if you were to practice Wing Chun these days, it'd be like, no, you have to do it exactly like Bruce Lee said. Like, that's not what Bruce Lee was talking about. Or the Gracies are a prime example of this, actually. Like, they marketed theirs as basically, we're the most effective fighting system. Like, we've built upon what judo used to do, and we're always going to be improving. And then once they hit market capitalization, they basically were like, no, you have to do it our way and there's no other way. And so it's just funny how things, given a long enough time scale, kind of becomes the, hey, no, you have to do it this way. There is no other way to do it. And then they end up stopping evolving, and then it ends up self-cannibalizing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think for you and your industry and for those of us in the other industries, it's like we actually have a chance to evolve it and make it better. And just because something's normal doesn't mean it's the best
right
way.
Yep, 100%.
Speaking to the sport evolving, what have you seen in your time as a coach and competitor, both from the general population, just the having fun with jiu-jitsu, and also the competitive side, the sports side of jiu-jitsu? Where in your time, what should I say, how have you seen the sport evolve from both ends?
So if you were to start Brazilian Jiu Jitsu when I started, there was literally no difference between Jiu Jitsu and MMA. Like those were literally the same thing. So there was a lot more striking and stuff like that. Basically, anybody who was doing Jiu Jitsu when I started, very rarely were they like a mom and dad hobbyist. They were getting in because they either wanted to fight MMA eventually. Actually, that was the vast majority of everybody. Very, very few strictly for like a self-defense purpose. And then through the years, as like the Ultimate Fighter kind of got bigger and Joe Rogan got popular, it just sent the message of what jiu-jitsu is out there. And so you start to get more and more regular people doing it, right? And so then we start to see it kind of steer away from the MMA aspect a little bit and start to go more towards the development of like what's called sport jiu-jitsu, which is basically more similar to like judo and wrestling instead of MMA. There's no strikes and things like that. And there's a definitive scoring system, and it's now a sport at that point. And then that gives like hobbyists and athletes something to do that doesn't involve CTE and things of that nature, which is very nice. So it's been nice to see the split from jiu-jitsu and MMA, even though you're going to hear a lot of old school guys complain about it. And sometimes rightfully so, that sometimes you get a little bit farther away from like the self-defense aspect of it. But like I tell anybody, a high school wrestler is going to beat the living shit out of the average person anyways. So a sports guy in jiu-jitsu is going to be fairly okay in a self-defense situation without having to practice the very specific self-defense moves and things like that. So that's where I'd say I would see the biggest evolution. And people in jiu-jitsu are way better now than when I started. Way better. Like a black belt world champion from 20 years ago, and Keenan Cornelius has said this, he got a lot of flame for it, but it's absolutely true, would barely be a purple belt world champion at this day and age. The sport has evolved tremendously, and to pretend like it hasn't is having your head in the sand.
Yeah. Speaking to wrestlers, I think this is more of a question for myself, and we do have a decent amount of wrestlers that listen to this. Are you seeing a greater influx of wrestlers into the sport of jiu-jitsu? And if so, any advice or things that you see that wrestlers need to work on as they kind of make their entrance into the sport of jiu-jitsu from a competition level?
So massive influx of wrestlers. I think that's because jiu-jitsu is, for whatever reason, has outpaced wrestling as far as pay goes. So you can make much more money now in jiu-jitsu than you can in wrestling, all things being equal. And I would say the biggest hurdle for wrestlers, besides just the stereotypical just get used to being on your back, is the change of pace to learn technique. I think in wrestling, not so much that it's less techniques. It is kind of less techniques, but you guys hammer those techniques going hard as fuck, right? But you can't quite drill a lot of these techniques in the same way in jiu-jitsu, either because the submission is going to be slightly more dangerous to the joint, and the longevity of it, and just I don't want to shit on wrestling as far as a technical aspect. I just think because you have more options in jiu-jitsu than you do in wrestling, just due to rule sets, because that's really all it is at the end of the day, you have to acquire more technical skills in jiu-jitsu than you do in wrestling, which means you have to rep things a little bit better and slower compared to like a wrestling practice, essentially.
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. So, like you said, aside from being on your back, because I know that was the biggest weird thing about jiu-jitsu for me, or learning curve, I should say, is that. So every time I start, dude, sit on your ass and pull guard.
Yep.
Learn how to, compete off your back. And then on top of that, the pace, absolutely. Because you get into jiu-jitsu and like everyone's like, this dude's a spaz. Chill out, man. But it's because it's just that go, go, go mentality in wrestling. And then when you go up against, a purple, brown, black belt, the quicker you move, they just catch you in shit that you didn't even know was possible. So,
Yep.
yeah, absolutely. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, I would, because I think we also have a lot of female listeners too. So you guys are in an industry that's dominated by male. I sort of in an opposite industry where it's more female dominated. And so in trying to attract females into your sport, like what would you, because I know my reasons for not doing it. Like I have neck issues. I don't want anyone touching my neck. I also have personal space issues. So I just don't want people touching me, period. So like I'm more drawn towards striking and the kickboxing because I can keep people out here. And I'm very protective of my joints, and it's why I've made it thus far in life without any major injuries. So aside from me, like other females, like what would you?
Well, the things you brought up are super common with females coming in, and just honestly, people in general that are coming in. So that's why we have a couple of different types of classes. We have our regular class, which is kind of geared towards your regular jiu-jitsu person who's not going to be too worried about personal space and stuff like that, right? But we were also the first gym in Central New York to have a dedicated women's program, which is now caught on everywhere in New York, which is awesome. So that can help a lot when you know you're going with another woman. Instead of going with some of the men, it takes some of that like ick factor out of it, right? And then we also have like our fundamentals, and we have an age of 40 over 40 class where there is no rolling in those classes. Those are classes just geared towards learning the technique. Until at least you become comfortable enough to, maybe do some light sparring. I'm a big advocate for sparring because, like I kind of talked about earlier, at the end of the day, it is a self-defense martial art. So I don't ever want people to. There are some gyms out there that strictly do self-defense and nobody ever goes hands-on. And at that point, you just turn into katas with karate, right? And that's something I always want to avoid. So yeah, and then just to touch on the striking point, and this is actually a big reason why I advocate for women to learn jiu-jitsu over striking. And this is no knock on any ladies out there who are sick kickboxers. It just becomes a size thing. And that's for jiu-jitsu as well, but it's very difficult to knock somebody out if you're a 130-pound woman going against like an average male. That being said, though, it's not out of the realm for you to take somebody's back and choke them out. I would say that's much more likely than a female knocking out a male.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I've thought about it. I hear the argument.
We're gonna get her. We're gonna get her. Just one. Speaking to the populations that you work with, another big reason why we want to get on here with you and talk is your work with first responders. Melissa and I have worked with first responders both from a nonprofit and from a profitable standpoint, military, police, fire, etc. I want to talk to you about your experience and what you're doing in Central New York, because I've seen a pretty powerful and meaningful program that you've built, and I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we are doing the first peer-reviewed study of its kind. It's going to be published through the Naval Academy. It's a longitudinal study showing the efficacy of consistent training with law enforcement with jiu-jitsu. So the way that we have the program set up right now is a standard law enforcement police academy is 6 months long. So during that 6 months, we get them twice a week for 48 classes. They go through our entire curriculum, and then we basically follow them for the next 6 years of their career and then compare their use of force, injuries on suspects, injuries to themselves compared to other officers who've not gone through the program. I think the average person has no idea how little training our law enforcement gets at basically 2 weeks during the academy. And then some academies will do some agencies will do like a 1 or 2 day refresher a year, if that. They're very inadequately prepared for their job. So this is something long-term that we are hoping, if the study does well enough, we can go to Congress and we can just be like, hey, you guys need to pay officers to either train jiu-jitsu or train more. They are not getting enough training.
Yeah, I know that all three of us here are we're for police officers. We want and need police officers, right? But having the skill of jiu-jitsu, not just for self-defense, but also restraining someone in a safe manner, makes them think twice about pulling a firearm out and making a decision that they might regret, both for the person and for them. Do you see jiu-jitsu being that kind of safeguard to pulling out that firearm?
Yeah, so during COVID, there was a Marietta study that came out, which is an internal study where they essentially did exactly what we are doing now, just over a much shorter time span, and it was basically a self-assessed study, which is why it's so important to have a peer-reviewed study. So they saw fantastic outcomes. It was I haven't looked at this study in a while, but basically they had a reduction of like 30% in like use of taser, everything across the board. Suspects were getting hurt less. Law enforcement were getting hurt less. Everything was better. Because a lot of the times what happens is you go to whatever tool you feel most comfortable with during an arrest based on a fear factor, essentially. You go in there, if you're really afraid, you feel like your life's on the line, you're going to go to a higher order that might not have been necessary had you had better training, right? Which is exactly what the Marietta study showed and what we're hoping that this is going to show when we publish.
That's really cool.
Do you have a name for your program? Is there a specific name for the program?
No, there's not a specific name off the bat. It's got a very long title for like the study. It's like LEO, like self-defense. I don't know. It's like a 30 thing. I cannot send it to you guys so you guys can put it out there. But the hope is it's a two-part. We do a survey with the recruits at the beginning, middle, and end, which is basically monitoring command presence or confidence levels with them putting hands on people. And then the longitudinal portion will hopefully be published in the next like 6-ish years is the goal.
Who are you heading this with, and who's collecting the data?
So Clark Petrie out of the Naval Academy. So he just started here full time. And he's a PhD math whiz, like super math nerd, which is perfect for them.
Excellent. What made you get into this? Where did this?
So me and the Liverpool Police Chief, Jerry Unger, were actually talking about just doing a big seminar for his department specifically. He trained jiu-jitsu with me forever, became the police chief of Liverpool, and was like, hey, I'd like to bring this to our department. I was like, cool, yeah, I'll do a seminar, no problem. Then COVID hits and puts everything on the back burner at that point. And then while COVID was going on, that Marietta study came out, and me and Jerry were like, hey, this is definitely something that we can do. That kind of opened up the door for us. We have been talking. So pre-COVID, I had been talking to another researcher, a psychologist, essentially trying to get that survey data portion of it done pre-COVID, because I had always kind of wanted to do some kind of study to force more training on officers anyways. And then when the Marietta study came out, we're like, hey, like this is something now that we can bring to departments. We now have at least some evidence saying, like, you guys are not going to be wasting money on this. It's not like us out of the blue saying, oh, trust us, guys, this is going to be a net positive for you with nothing to back it up. So we at least had some evidence, and Syracuse ate it up. Syracuse was having some issues with use of force, and they needed to the department needed to implement some changes, and we were one of those changes. So the Syracuse police brought us on, which has been awesome.
What's the difference in strategy coaching general population and first responders? What is because obviously, I'm sure you know who Tim Kennedy is. He's and the work that he's doing with Sheepdog Response. when he's working with first responders, he's like, in most cases, in quote unquote, what Tim says, old man jiu-jitsu won't work in this case. That's how you get killed. Because people can stab you with a knife, shoot with the gun, gouge your eyes out, bite you. So how does that change? How does the sport jiu-jitsu change and make it more applicable for first responders?
Yep. So distance management changes significantly and goals, right? So it's okay to be on your butt in a jiu-jitsu match. It is less than ideal, obviously, if this is an encounter on the street. So it's essentially would be like jiu-jitsu, but with a little bit more focus on the wrestling aspect of things. And so the big thing is we need to get on up or get on top as fast as possible, or create distance so that we can assess the situation. So those are the big three goals for the law enforcement going through our program. Now they do learn like standard jiu-jitsu sweeps and some standard jiu-jitsu hold downs and things like that. We also teach them ways for them to have weapon retention, but at the very end of the day, they either need to get on top with control, get up to their feet with control, or create distance with control. Those are the big three.
One of the things that I'm hearing that you're talking about too is like there's a component of mindfulness here, because if you like that, and it's not a long pause, but you have to be reacting, but there also has to be choice in your response.
Yes.
In that moment. And I know you have yoga at your gym, and so I'm kind of wondering like how you address the role of the nervous system, especially in situations with your first responders.
Yeah. So the big, what was that? So I was going to say the big thing is people just in high stress situations default back onto their training, right? And it has to be training that they've done enough where it starts to become an automatic response. So at the end of the day, we get them 2 times a week for the 6 months. So they get, quite a bit more training than your average officer, but I would still like to see more, because we'll see by the time we hit the end of the 6 months, when we go back to, let's say, like weeks like 5 or 6 to review material, and this comes back on the whole preface of the studies to show through consistent training, consistent positive outcomes. You'll see that the officers have, as they should, have forgotten quite a bit. Right. And you have to review it and you're like, oh yeah, now I remember. It takes a little bit, right? But in a situation that's high stress, you're not going to have that little bit to think about. So they all know, and we preach quite a bit on just consistency, and that's what you'll fall back on, even if you don't think about it. So, yeah.
Is there, when seeking, besides yourself, when seeking practitioners and coaches for a program like this, besides just experience in sport jiu-jitsu, are there certifications or baseline metrics that you're looking for people to have credentials, I should say, not baseline metric, but credentials? Are there like combative jiu-jitsu certifications where they're teaching people that know sport jiu-jitsu, but teaching them and coaching them on coaching first responders combative jiu-jitsu?
So there's quite a few programs out there. There's the Gracies have a program where they'll certify police through basically teaching their stuff. I went through the EFC course with Jay Wadsworth and Matt Secor, which was absolutely fantastic.
What does the EFC stand for?
Oh God, you're putting me on the spot.
Sorry. If you don't, I'll make sure to put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll put it in the notes. But his course is fantastic. It's a lot. So it's jiu-jitsu still a core component, but this is much more specifically geared towards law enforcement. So like when we were going through that, we were covering a lot of cuffing. So when we designed our jiu-jitsu program for the study, we wanted to we did not want to cover too much that they already cover on DT, because that would be a waste of our time and a waste of theirs, right? So that EFC course with Jay Wadsworth, they're covering everything that you would typically cover in DT. They'll go much more in depth in like weapon retention. If somebody has a knife in the fight, those are certain things that we do not go over just based on our time constraints, right? And Tim Kennedy's Sheepdog program, they have the same exact thing. There's a lot of programs out there. I highly recommend the EFC course with Jay. But yeah, those much more specific to the job, those types of courses. Not that our jiu-jitsu course isn't. Ours is also made by law enforcement. We had guys like Don Patty, Sean Bergman, Nick Newman, Jerry Unger, all of them helped design that course. We're all lifetime law enforcement. But it was more in mind with like, hey, we're not stepping on the toes of DT. We're trying to stay separate, but still help law enforcement. But the EFC course is very much all inclusive.
Once this study's published, are you looking for this to be a nationwide thing? Are you looking to grow this with people that are qualified to do so?
So I have not personally decided exactly how we're going to tackle this after we publish. It can go a couple of different ways. I would personally like to avoid the and I might not have a choice, but the route of like only my instructors can show this stuff, because really at the end of the day, I just want law enforcement training more. And if we have to approach departments and be like, hey, you got to pick our program over such and such a program, and this is what it's going to cost, they might just say, forget it altogether. So at the end of the day, the true goal of this study is to mandate training. It does not necessarily have to be like through my specific program. I just want officers to train more, even if that means that they have to do DT twice a week. At the end of the day, I really don't care. I really think that if we can get all officers training more, that will be the change that we need to see. You won't see any more of this defund the police BS or anything like that pop up. I think it will be such a net positive that it'll put police bullshit on the back burner for a very long time.
Yeah, so you're really talking less about building I don't want to call it a small or even a nationwide business model. You're actually talking about policy change.
Yes.
In terms of yeah. Because I mean, the other thing that I'm hearing from you too, like different departments, a police officer in Englewood, Chicago is going to have very different, than Northfield, Vermont, that's, while it benefits everyone, there's ways to tailor this to their specific needs is what I'm hearing.
100%. And sometimes if you go too general, right, you lose a lot of the benefits of some specificity, like different states have different laws and things like that. So yeah, policy is at the end of the day what I want changed.
That's cool.
I love that. Melissa and I have been speaking about starting a nonprofit in Pennsylvania once I'm done grad school. And because what we see in need is not just from a combative standpoint, but a PTSD, tactical training. So almost like a global approach to taking care of these men and women who protect us, because there's not enough of that, and finding funding to do so, because there's very much a lack of funding all over the place.
Yeah, and I think it's also creating funding. There's a lot of conversation that happens about the need to, like they talk with first responders, veterans about like sleep being an issue. And it's like, well, yeah, that is a great conversation. And it's great that we're bringing certain tools, but tell that to the firefighter who is having to get up at 1 a.m., 1:30 to, we've got to meet people where they're at. It's really creating the programs that actually can make a difference in these populations.
100%. And there's some like low-hanging fruit that I think would make a big difference. And this is just things that won't happen, but I think that should. Like, I think people forget, especially let's say like in the Syracuse area specifically for police. So when you do a tour as a military vet, like you have a 6-month window typically that you're out there deployed, right? For the average police officer, it is every single day for the 20 years that they're on the job with no time off as far as like being on the road. Some people can deal with that great, other people cannot. I think there needs to be some kind of like rotation with how long people are on the road versus doing other things, just so that it's not that constant high stakes, high stress environment that especially officers that are in like cities and like areas that aren't great, that are constantly in that. But that's not anything that's ever going to get addressed anytime soon or fixed. So yeah.
Before we wrap this up, just want to ask you any important advice that you have for people trying to get into jiu-jitsu. First day, walking into your facility, what advice do you have for them?
So pick the gym based on where you have the best vibe at. So there might be a gym, it could even be a gym like mine where it comes highly recommended, but you come in and you don't like the ball busting atmosphere, don't join that gym. Find a gym that you fit in at, because at the end of the day, right, unless you enjoy it, you're not going to show up. So check out a bunch of different places. Jiu-jitsu's gotten a lot more popular. There's lots of gyms now everywhere. Check them out. Join the place where you fit in the most.
Awesome, man. I love it. Where can people find you at after today's episode? What's your Instagram, and how can people reach out to you if they have more questions?
Haven Jiu Jitsu is the Instagram handle. We've got a Facebook page, Haven Jiu Jitsu. If you type in Haven Jiu Jitsu, we're the US one. We're not the one that's in like Norway or whatever. But yeah, you guys, if anybody types in Haven Jiu Jitsu or Ben Tallini, I will pop right up. So
excellent, brother. Well, listen, man, we really appreciate your time. Looking forward to doing this again at some point, and having more conversation around that nonprofit work, and expanding that.
Yeah. We didn't even talk about that, but yeah. Sounds good, Jim.
You got it, brother. All right, man. We appreciate you. Everyone, thank you for tuning in for another episode of the Primal Performance Podcast. We will see you next time.
See you guys.